Hi, my name is Veronica Irwin, and I am the regulatory reporter at Unchained. I'm coming to you from the Blockchain Association Policy Summit in Washington, D.C. this week. And this is an interview that I recorded with former CFTC Chair Giancarlo at the D.C. offices of Willkie Farr and Gallagher before the summit got going.
It's great to be with you, Veronica. I'm Giancarlo. I'm the former chairman of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission. I'm senior counsel at Willkie Farr and Gallagher, and I'm also the executive chairman of the Digital Dollar Project.
So just to start, easy open question, what are the most important things that Trump could do for crypto in his first 100 days?
Well, I think that, broadly speaking, Trump needs to do three things, and some of them will be able to be done in the first 100 days, and others are going to take longer, but basically it's got to actually stop bad policy that's in place today. Then he's got to deliver on a series of various promises made about crypto, and then thirdly, put in place good policy. So in terms of bad policy, we've got to repeal what's called Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, which prevents traditional institutions from custodying crypto. We've got to get rid of bad policymakers, people like Gary Gensler, which he's named specifically, but also Crenshaw at the SEC, who's been hostile to crypto, perhaps even more than Gary Gensler, and Marty Gruenberg at FDIC is responsible for the debanking of crypto. And that brings me to the next bad policy, and that is the debanking of crypto that needs to be ended. We also part of that bad policy, some of these really egregious lawsuits and appeals that really have either lost at the trial court or are very dubious to begin with based upon really obscure legal theories by the SEC or the SEC going beyond their jurisdiction. We've got to end those activities. And then in terms of delivering on promises, allowing people to self-host crypto, to have their own wallets, to deliver on the crypto counsel, to deliver on the Bitcoin strategic stockpile, and finally to deliver on promises about perhaps an end to capital gains tax on crypto transactions. And those are some specific promises that have been made to deliver on. And then finally, we can get to the point of doing good policy. We need good policy for stablecoins, good legislation. We need to either pass or replace Fit for the 21st Century with good crypto legislation. And then finally, we need good regulations out of the SEC and the CFTC. So those are the three buckets, I'd say. Let's end the bad stuff that's going on now. Policies that are in place, never been announced, never been approved by Congress, bureaucrat whims policy like debanking. Let's get rid of that. Let's deliver on the promises, and then let's get good policy in place.
Is there any of that he can get started on now before he comes to office? Obviously, he's made most of the nominations that we're waiting on for crypto other than CFTC chair.
Exactly. So I think those are important ones. I think he's already said we should stockpile crypto. I don't know why the current administration continues to sell national stocks of crypto. The nation has made their choice. They voted in favor of Trump's crypto policies as opposed to the previous administration's crypto policies. So I think out of deference to the nation, if not to Trump, the current administration should stop those sales. Whether they will or not, I don't know. They still seem to be wanting to push Carolyn Crenshaw forward for a reappointment to the SEC. I think that the nation's pretty much voted against that approach. So I would like to see that nomination stalled.
Mm-hmm. So we, as well as Wired, reported that crypto policy groups were consulted in the selection of Paul Atkins for SEC chair. But at least my sources, they seemed pretty in the dark when it came to David Sachs for crypto czar. Nobody seemed to see that one coming. What do you know about how David Sachs was selected?
I'm not a source for inside baseball. It's just not where my mind goes or where I've heard certain things. I've been party to certain conversations, but it's not. I think people consult me on policy issues, so I'm not going to. If you don't mind, I'm not going to go there. What I will tell you is that David Sachs is very capable. David Sachs was with Elon Musk at PayPal. He knows J.D. Vance. He was one of the very first Silicon Valley luminaries to break for Trump and hosted an important fundraiser, which he brought a lot of people into the Trump fold. And I think that's very important. I think David Sachs, with his investment success, with his a broad set of contacts in his mind, will make a great crypto czar at the broad policy level. I think he's not a Washingtonian. I think the role of czar and the team he's assembling are going to need to be able to have very direct conversations with chairs of banking committees, of financial service committees, of tax writing committees in Congress to achieve the president's agenda. They're going to need to have conversations with people like Paul Atkins and the next chair of the CFTC to get good policy out of them. They're going to need to work with Treasury on the stockpiling of Bitcoin. So having inside the Beltway chops. So I would imagine that David Sachs, as intelligent as he is and as broad-minded as he is going to need to assemble a team to help him get those things done. So I'm very confident in that pick, but I think Sachs has got a big job to do.
That feeds just into my next question really well, which is just that Axios kind of implied in their coverage of this that Sachs didn't have to sell his crypto because this was like an advisory role. I also saw in Bloomberg that that he had a certain number of days out of the year that he was allowed to work. There was kind of like a limited part-time position. The implication here is that he's not subject to that OGE requirement that he not own crypto. And I think a lot of people are wondering that what will his job actually entail? You mentioned a team. Are you able to elaborate on that at all?
I think it's still under consideration. I think I have spoken to David. He does know what he knows. He also knows what he doesn't know. He knows what his capabilities are. He also knows what capabilities he needs to add, and how that works itself out into what that staff looks like. I think he's best to answer,
Okay.
But he's still considering what that's going to look like.
Mm-hmm. It's coming from San Francisco. It's been interesting to see him selected. Another maybe a appointment that you might be a little bit more willing to speak about, or not appointment, nomination. Brian Quintenz, you mentioned that you endorsed him on X.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about why you think he's good for the role of CFTC Chair?
Yeah. So I want to begin by saying there are a number of very good nominees. In my tweet, I mentioned a number of them. I think any one of those are capable of being chair of the agency. All of the people I mentioned know the agency. They're also forward-leaning in terms of innovation. And that's one of the hallmarks of the CFTC. It's always been the most forward-leaning of all the alphabet soup of the financial regulators in Washington. More new products have emerged in the CFTC jurisdiction than virtually all the other regulators combined. It's a pretty impressive record. And so anybody that's going to lead that agency has to have that track record or that predilection. The reason I endorse Brian perhaps is a sense of loyalty. Brian was my wingman during my 2.5 years as chairman of the agency. And during that time, we accomplished a number of groundbreaking initiatives. Lab CFTC for one of them, the Bitcoin futures for another, the beginning of the work that led to Ethereum futures for another, the resolution of decades-long unresolved issues between ourselves and the SEC, products that were caught between the two agencies that never got done. I asked Brian to task a task force with Hester Peirce, and together they were able to resolve a number of issues. When we greenlighted Bitcoin futures, it wasn't just overseas regulators. It was some U.S. regulators, and it was actually the industry itself that was opposed to our greenlight. There were full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal taken out to tell us, do not greenlight Bitcoin futures. When it seemed that the whole world was against our continuing the tradition of being forward-leaning at the CFTC, Brian Quintenz was there supporting the action. And so, as a former chairman, there are times when I feel it's not appropriate for me to weigh in, but this time I did feel that Brian's support for me then merited my support for him now.
As we reported last week, my understanding is he's definitely a top contender for the role. So that was exciting to see you go on X and say that. kind of on that, will you and other prominent, like crypto knowledgeable people, obviously with regulatory experience as well, and connections to the administration, will you continue to weigh in on crypto policy during the administration next year?
Yes.
Okay.
Very much so.
Would you be able to talk about to what extent?
I think that the political risk that with the support of Brian Quintenz and, frankly, Russ Benham, who's now chairman of the CFTC, took in 2017 to greenlight Bitcoin futures. The political risk we took to create Lab CFTC, the political risk we took to create Project KISS, which was a review of a lot of old CFTC rules and modernization. When you take those risks, if they pay off, as Bitcoin futures has, 8 years later, that product is deep, it's liquid, it's transparent, it's well-regulated, it's relatively free of fraud manipulation. When those political risks pay off, you earn some degree of political capital. And I think if anything, that political capital allows me to speak to issues of crypto and crypto policy with some degree of credibility. And I have high hopes for this administration. It has successfully identified the bad policy that has been pursued by the Biden administration over the last 4 years. I mean, debanking is bad policy. It's probably illegal. And if it's not illegal, it needs to be made illegal. Sub 121 is bad policy. And I think the incoming administration has clearly and clear-eyedly identified that. They need to take those out. Now, on the other hand, getting good policy in place is going to be hard work. The fact that so many new legislators were elected on a pro-crypto stance means they're all going to want to have a piece of this new legislation. It would be remarkable if Fit for the 21st Century is passed in the form it is, because every one of these new legislators is going to want to have a piece of what it looks like. Shepherding a good piece of legislation through is going to be very hard work. And if I can bring one thing to bear, it would be maybe a disciplined process of speaking up when it's going off the rails, shepherding good policy through, and doing that in a judicious, sort of careful, thoughtful, disciplined way. If people follow me on Twitter, they'll see I don't tweet every day. I don't have something to say on every issue of the day. I weigh in when I think something's important. I think part of being a former chairman is to be somewhat judicious in when one speaks and to preserve that political capital that perhaps I earned during my time in government.
It's interesting that you mentioned all the new lawmakers that are going to want to have a piece of market structure legislation. I wouldn't be surprised if some folks that didn't weigh in on crypto also want to have a part of it because of the amount of money Fairshake has raised already for the midterms.
I think that's a very astute observation. Let me make another observation. It may be somewhat counterintuitive to some of your listeners, but in fact, many ways, the Biden administration is responsible. If crypto heretofore is described as a casino of speculation, then the Biden administration actually is responsible for that. Because their policies have actually kept traditional financial players out of the space because of their reputational risk or the regulatory risk. Actually warning some CEOs that are registered with the SEC, don't get into this space, otherwise you're going to have problems with us as an agency, the SEC. By actually doing away with the bad policies that force out responsible players, I think you're going to see traditional finance come into this space in a big way with their industrial grade systems and compliance structures and others, and are going to help this industry mature in a way. It's actually, again, it may be counterintuitive, but I think it's going to be Trump that's going to usher in the mature era, the full building, but building in a environment that has both new entrants and traditional players playing side by side with the synergies that will produce, as opposed to what we've had in the last 4 years. It was a zone in which only the most fearless could enter. And so I'm very optimistic for what the future of this industry will bring. There's no question there's going to be starts and stops. No question that there's going to be volatility and others ahead. That's with any new technology. but now we're going to allow the most traditional of our fine American financial firms to come into this arena and bring the maturity that they carry with them.
I've been saying I got this job at the right time.
You sure did.
Started covering crypto regulation like October 1st. Like this is great.
Timing is everything in life, you know.
The last question I had was, you've been working on the digital dollar project, as you mentioned, ever since you left as chair of the CFTC. How likely do you think a CBDC in the next 4 years might be?
Very unlikely. Trump, in his speech he gave in Nashville in July of 2024, pledged that there would be no U.S. CBDC. That's actually very compatible with the position of the Digital Dollar Project, which doesn't advocate for a U.S. CBDC. And we feel strongly that it's way too premature for the U.S. to even consider deploying one. But the questions we at the Digital Dollar ask remain as relevant as ever. The questions we ask is, in this coming world of both decentralized, i.e. Bitcoin, and highly centralized systems of value, whether they be CBDCs out of Europe or China, or whether they be stablecoins operated by stablecoin operators, which are centralized systems, how do we future-proof the dollar for that world? How do we preserve its reserve currency status? And perhaps most importantly, how do we preserve the values for which the dollar has historically stood? The values of free trade, free commerce, and at a personal level, free economic expression, free from surveillance, censorship, and control, whether that surveillance, censorship, and control is done by a government or whether it's done by a big tech company. We began the conversation talking about debanking. How easy would it be for some government licensing authority to say to a stablecoin operator, hey, your license is coming up for renewal. What a shame it would be if we had to actually deny a renewal because you're allowing people to buy ammunition with their stablecoin, or you're allowing them to fund Planned Parenthood or Right to Life, depending on whatever the disfavored industry is of the day, as we've seen with Choke Point 1.0 and now Choke Point 2.0. Take it from me, Choke Point 3.0 could be all about stablecoins and government licensure. And so if we're going to express a digital form of the dollar through the private sector, which is what stablecoins are, aren't these issues of surveillance and control just as important whether it's done by the private sector as whether it's done by the public sector? So our work at the Digital Dollar Project is both focused on CBDCs and digital dollars offered by the private sector. Whenever you centralize a system, you're going to have these risks. And the fact of the matter is Americans are going to be faced with CBDCs and stablecoins no matter whether or not the U.S. deploys a digital dollar or not. When we travel to Europe 3 years from now, we're going to be dealing with digital euros. Athletes to the Beijing Olympics dealt with digital yuan. So we're going to be faced with this. We need to ask those questions. How do we modernize the dollar for this digital future and do so in a way that's consistent with our values?